My name is David Waldrop. I'm the Executive Director and CEO of the Medical Association of Atlanta. Today's webinar, Physician Real Estate Planning, is geared towards educating physicians considering leasing medical space. I am joined today by Michael Ulin of MAA Gold Sponsor RG Real Estate. Michael, thank you for joining us to talk about how physicians should be aware of several crucial points to ensure that leases meet their practices operational, legal, and financial needs. Before we begin, can you introduce yourself and your work at RGRE?
Great. David, good morning. Thanks so much for arranging time and to talk about a topic that I'm really passionate about. So I'm Michael Ulin. I am with RGRE. We are a full service commercial real estate firm. So we are set up to support tenants and owners and investors in commercial real estate. And my role is to be the physician's advocate, right? I'm there to help navigate complex real estate transactions, whether that be leasing, acquisitions, sales, or investments.
So let's start with some questions covering lease term, renewal options. Does property ownership make sense for physicians?
Absolutely, ownership can make sense for physicians in a lot of cases. Now, I understand there's going to be some limitations. Some providers really need to be on or near the hospital campus, and that might be a limitation. They might need to lease, and that might be preferred, and that's totally fine for flexibility. But when I think about ideal protection for providers, I always like to encourage them to have control over the physical space, right? That's the economic driver of the practice. But I come from an accounting background, so that just might be the practical part of me thinking like that. But in longer term, though, there's a really distinct opportunity, especially with physicians and professionals, to create an asset or an investment as through this long-term ownership when occupied by the practice.
So how do physicians balance their long-term business goals and potential growth when negotiating the lease term?
It is a tricky balance, right? It's delicate. And when you're thinking about these lease term commitments, now clearly there are cases where it really makes sense to lock in longer terms. You will essentially have some protection from market risk, rental rate risk, these increases that we are seeing, some dramatic in certain cases. But what you're most likely doing with the long-term lease commitments is you're maximizing a landlord's contribution to construction and improvement costs, right? And we clearly know there's been a significant increase in those costs across the board. It's everything from concrete to gypsum, so everything has crept up a lot, and not to even touch labor. But there are those instances where you're early in the life cycle of the practice, or a group is thinking about a market expansion, going to a new area and opening an office. So, we want to be mindful that maybe we want a shorter term arrangement there, and we want to be focused on the economics and not over committing. And as an advisor, if I'm supporting a group there, we might look for a shorter lease term, but we're also going to look for space that might lend itself to occupy easier, right? Built out space that we don't have to recreate the wheel, if you will, and build everything out all over again. So we can try to keep that term flexible. But, lastly, in that case, still, we're going to be looking for some protections. And for me, that means we want to secure renewal options. So even if you said, I'm going to start with 3 or 5 years, I still want to feel like they're locked in where they have an opportunity to stay. But it really is that delicate balance of trying to get that idea of where they see the practice going and in what amount of time.
So when is the ideal time to think about, a pending lease expiration and that we should renew it or start discussing that?
Well, I think one of the things I talk about a lot, and I really feel like physicians are a little more focused today on creating the optimal patient experience in whatever physical location they're in. So ideally, you really have to think about a renewal at least a year in advance, right? Because that's the only time where you can really stop and think about assessing operations, addressing the space itself and any efficiency or inefficiency, and where you might be headed with regard to growth, more patients, adding an additional provider, right? All those things are important as you think about how the space suits your operation. But you also need time to think about gathering market intelligence, right? If you don't have some other thought about what's going on in the market, you wouldn't really know quite how to negotiate that renewal. So you need time. And I think what often really gets overlooked are specific trigger dates. So there are times in your lease where you have specific notice times where you've got to tell a landlord you intend or don't intend to renew. And this is really tricky. And I came across a situation this year where the landlord really didn't want the tenant to stay, meaning they had another group who wanted the space. So if you didn't get those dates right when you hit that notification, you might not have that opportunity to renew. And for that particular group, that was a complex lab setup. You don't want to get squeezed out of your space when it's, several $100,000 to replace it and do it again. So you really want that time to assess the needs and get that intel before you're making any decisions, right? And so part of having somebody in your corner is helping guide you with that information and managing that time for you.
So let's move to rent structure and increases. How does having an advisor guide medical professionals on understanding leases and economics of leasing medical space?
Well, at any given time, we know there's a potential range of rental rates in any market, and then, of course, all markets. So having an advisor helps bring more data and intellect into the process. Not to mention a buffer, but when you have somebody who's in the market, somebody who's knowledgeable in commercial real estate supporting healthcare providers specifically, you have deals that you've completed, so you're bringing that data, those data points, into any negotiation for leverage and getting the best potential terms, right? I personally, I'm constantly active in deals, whether they're new deals, restructured renewals, but I'm looking at activity and I'm looking at trends. So when you imagine the typical tenant, it's a physician, it's a medical group, and they only think about the economics every 5 or 7 years. But I'm somebody who's looking at it every day. So I'm seeing a lot more data. And I think that's really what brings the most value because clearly, in the end of the day, the physical space, the occupancy cost, that's often the second largest expense for a practice after payroll. So it's really critical to get it right. You've got to live with it for years.
So looking into tenant improvements, allowances, spaces need to be modified to fit the practice. Uh, what's the landlord's responsibility, or is there a allowance? How do we deal with that?
There is no perfect rule. This is art and science. but but this is probably the biggest area of potential value for any medical tenant, right? When I talked earlier about the fact that costs have increased for construction, what you used to be able to build out for $70 a foot is now closer to $100 a foot. And those are real dollars when you've got to get construction work completed. So this is a little bit of the dance between, owner and tenant in terms of who's going to cover what. So this is what the negotiation is really all about. I do think that, a lot of owners go in with an expectation of what they're willing to pay. But, let's remember, we've got different types of medical owners. There's the large institutional types, clearly have a lot of capital, but you've got some smaller local, or even if the physician is an owner of the building themselves, well, they may not have as much capital or not want to spend as much on a tenant. So, again, going back to the advisory hat, I'm looking at data points for what typical deals, how they're structured, what kind of money goes into that allowance. And then I'm using all the data points where I have personally negotiated. So now I'm not just looking at one market, say Alpharetta. No, I'm looking at everything I've done, whether that's Stockbridge or Marietta, Decatur. I'm bringing all of that information together. So the more you begin to understand about the market and the specific assets, the better positioned you are, right? So when we are, researching and understanding owners and their motives, we start to look for the opportunity in negotiation for that.
So clarity is required on who's responsible to maintain and fix things, and how do positions minimize their responsibilities where possible to keep focus on patient care and versus managing a building.
Well, this one is another tricky topic, but what I've learned over 18 years is we're only as good as what we have in writing, right? So we need to spell things out clearly when we are getting that lease agreement done. And so generally, we expect owners to handle the responsibility for property management and have that responsibility for maintenance and repairs. And there will still be some carve outs, right? Landlords will seek to limit what they're responsible for, maybe not inside the suite or, problems that may be caused by the tenant inside, specifically with plumbing. But if the physician is the owner of the building, well, then they're responsible for things day to day, right? And if that physician in that case actually has other tenants in their building, it might make sense to outsource some of that management, for someone to take care of those things, because otherwise those little tasks, they're going to get pushed off to the practice manager. Or if the physician has to handle it, they start to stack up and it's just really disruptive from the focus of patient care, right? That's really where they need to keep their time and their best value.
So if we look at lease termination, flexibility, how can we achieve flexibility in leases and understanding conditions under which leases can be terminated early and what we might have to pay in penalties?
Yeah, again, this all comes down to being really clear upfront in what's in the negotiation and what's in writing, right? And and understandably, landlords don't necessarily want to let tenants out early or easily. We're making we're making these agreements for a reason. But I found that, most owners clearly will, at a minimum, allow a subleasing right for a tenant. And that may not be ideal, and the tenant is still on the hook, but you at least have the opportunity to have somebody replace you if for some reason you've outgrown the space or your situation has changed, right? Maybe you sold the practice or you've just changed, don't need to be in that market, additional physician, one less physician, something economically has changed. But there are specific situations where, a landlord might agree to a specific termination. Now, it very often is going to have a specific trigger date, right? It won't be a termination that's floating, but it might be a very specific option after a certain number of years or months. So you have to be really clear on what notice you have to give and how to do it right. But if you have that kind of termination, you still can expect some kind of a penalty. And I think most landlords start with the perspective of they want to be made whole, right? They spent a lot of money in getting this deal done. Construction costs, maybe certain rent incentives, and commissions paid. An owner may have their own representation, and if the tenant had representation, all those things get factored into the deal cost. So they need to be dealt with potentially as a penalty, or maybe even unamortized, whatever's remaining. So but lastly, though, as a really proactive advocate, I like to look for protections and terminations that are tied to death and disability. So at a minimum, in any unforeseen situation, there's a way to unwind the lease obligation. Unfortunately, I have seen this personally, and nothing is more complicated and painful and frustrating to be dealing with an issue and still have a lease obligation. So those again are tied to a certain trigger and a timing and a certain specified penalty, which could be as easy as a certain number of months penalty, or some other configuration of costs spent to secure that tenant.
So do you run into compliance and zoning issues? What ensures that we're meeting regulations and ADA requirements that we have to comply with?
Yeah, I think ADA clearly is the biggest one, right? Those codes change both for the exterior of a property and the interior. And, you know, we find most of the time, landlords are going to take on that responsibility. Look, especially for the exterior, especially for interiors, ADA can affect everything from hallways, doors, restrooms, and especially ambulatory surgery centers. So when it comes to the interior of the space, we're typically asking owners to be responsible for maintaining codes and delivering spaces that meet current ADA. So that also can be, combined together with whatever that tenant improvement allowance is for construction. Sometimes those ADA issues get swept up into that allowance, and other times we've got to call them out specifically, because we've got to make certain conditions that accommodate the tenant. But I have seen cases personally where we've asked the landlord to add extra ADA parking spaces, right? Because either it was deficient or we felt like it just wasn't enough for that particular group, that use. It just tied to their population in particular. And the other issue about compliance is sometimes with zoning. Now, we don't typically have issues with zoning with medical office buildings, but when we get to less traditional spaces, maybe retail, but more likely if you're thinking about acquiring a property and changing it to a medical use, I found the best way to resolve that is to be proactive in talking to the city planning organization. So in advance this use will be approved, or you can figure out very quickly what special use permits or rezoning you're going to need.
So finally, let's talk about exclusive use and non-compete clauses. When can physicians secure exclusive use clauses so that other people aren't competing, renting spaces nearby?
Yeah, this one's really sensitive to owners. You think about landlords, clearly they are in the business of getting spaces leased, right? So they want to lease to as many potential tenants as possible. But, there are situations where you can consider protections for certain uses, but, typically it's going to be driven by the building size and the physical space occupied by the tenant, right? So, for example, in a large medical office building, it's going to be harder to get an exclusive just because there's so much space. But for example, if you're a health system, and you're taking up a lot of space, fine, you might get an exclusive. You're a great credit tenant, landlords want to work around you. Separately, if you're a large user in the building, in some cases that might mean you take 15 to 20% of the building, then you are in a much better position to secure that kind of exclusive. And it doesn't surprise us, and buildings especially that are near the hospital campus, to see multiple providers of a certain specialty. But look, I think you should approach every lease negotiation making the asks for the things that you think are important, and you focus on the deal breakers. And again, when you really begin to understand the economics of the situation, how much occupancy and vacancy in that building versus the market, you just might find situations where, you've got an owner who's just more willing, more hungry, to lock in a really good tenant, so that it's all part of the negotiation.
Well, Michael, this was excellent. We will include Michael's contact information in the show notes, so please be sure to check out those and share with your networks and anyone who might be interested. We would like to thank the audience for tuning in, and thank again Michael for sharing his time and expertise. We appreciate RGRE's support and look forward to a continued partnership. As a reminder, please stay tuned for future MAA webinars, and thank you.
Great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the
So
opportunity
glad to have you.
to talk.